Hi, this is Kerwin Gaines, and welcome to the agenda. Every week, it seems like we're in a different studio and we're doing different things, but this week, we're right here at DETV Studios, and we're excited to talk about affirmative action, not just here in the state of Delaware, but all over the country. As you may know, the Supreme Court earlier this week, on Monday actually, has decided to hear a case in regards to affirmative action. And they are going to review whether or not affirmative action is going to stay. It has been a part of our way of hiring. It's been a way of bringing people into education and giving one of the true beginners of equity in this country. And it's possibly going to go away. So tonight I am pleased to introduce our guest, Dr. Charlisa Edelin from Delaware State University. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Edelen, this evening.
Thank you for having me.
So your role at Del State is you are the co-chair of legal studies?
I'm the co-director of the Law Studies program, which is a new program. This is our first year of having that program, and we're training young people to go to law school.
Well, that's great. DSU is doing a lot of great things. You don't have to go to University of Pennsylvania or all these other schools around us. DSU is preparing the nation's leaders, future nation leaders, right here in the state of Delaware and Kent County. So we're excited about it, and we're always anxious to support the university in any way that we possibly can. And we welcome you this evening here on the agenda.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about this topic for sure. It's appropriate and it's hot, and we need to make sure that the public understands the gravity of the situation.
Right. So coming from a collegiate perspective, we've had previous conversations on and off the air about, what's going to happen. And to me, me personally, I'm a little worried, and definitely dealing with the schools here in our state. But DSU, you made it very clear that they didn't participate in using race as a factor in deciding whether or not students were accepted to the university.
Exactly. And I'm going to parrot what our president says all the time, that, we are unapologetically the most diverse HBCU in the country. And we don't use a race-based classification to grant students admission to our college. Anyone can apply. And if you stepped on our campus, you would see that while we're at HBCU. And so we celebrate our history of being a college that was, created for African-American students when there was segregation. We also celebrate now the diversity that we have. We have probably one of the most diverse faculties. We have something about 40% African-American faculty, something like another 30%, don't quote me on this, another 30% of actually 37% white faculty, and about 19% Asian, and about 7% other. That's pretty diverse. And that very much matches our student body. So for Delaware State University, affirmative action, whether it stays or goes, I don't think is going to affect us greatly. My hope is one of the reasons why it's great that we've developed this law studies program. If students feel that they cannot get into some of the elite colleges because affirmative action no longer has that door open for them, we'll be ready to accept them and ready to give them the same, or if not better, education. I'm a proud graduate of an HBCU law school, and that hasn't stopped me or hindered me in any way. And I've been able to walk in some of the biggest law firms in the country.
Well, first of all, I'd like to consider DSU a elite university,
Absolutely.
and and I know that there's a lot of alumni here and active students that would agree with me in our great state of Delaware. But back to this case, a lot of people may think that this is a white-black issue, but it's not. The findings of this case is that two universities, Harvard University and University of North Carolina, a conservative group is bringing a suit to them saying that Asian students, not black students, but Asian students are being overlooked in this process. And a lot of people might find that very interesting, right? And they feel as though the Asian students feel as though that they have been overlooked, and that basically affirmative action is not applicable to them. But I find that very interesting. The Asian population in the United States is coming off a very difficult summer, and 2021, where there's been several attacks on Asian families and Asian individuals in this country, just basically about race. So, finding it very interesting that they are not complaining, but feel as though affirmative action should be taken away in regards to decision of education. Um, I think that affirmative action in this country may need some modification. I will agree with you there. But also, I do think that removal of it, in my opinion, and I understand as I would nowhere near consider myself a journalist, but I would say that I have to maintain some part of impartiality in presenting these issues and topics. But I do believe that affirmative action is still necessary. So finding it interesting here and finding it interesting that this conservative group is pushing so hard. And the problem that we're having now is that the Supreme Court is very conservative, right? And there is a conservative majority. So we're kind of leaning on the fact that we have an idea of how this may go, and that's worrying a lot of people. Your thoughts, Doctor?
Absolutely. So actually, let me just unpack a couple of things you said there. First of all, the pitting of Asian Americans versus African Americans is an old racist trope and an old racist trick. If you may be younger than me and may not remember when Time magazine put on the cover that Asian Americans were the model minority, and the backlash from the NAACP and African Americans was fierce. And they had to render an apology, but that has been a trope or a strategy, almost like the Southern strategy that has been in the United States for decades. So before it was their model minority citizens, they come and they work quietly and they open stores and they don't bother anybody, to now, they're the best and the brightest of our students. And, African Americans are the reason that some of them aren't getting into school. So, so number one, that is, it's an old strategy, and unfortunately it's working again. And secondly, let me just go back a little bit and just talk about what's happening. Just to talk about what's happening with the Harvard case. So the SFFA is the organization that is actually pushing this litigation through the Supreme Court.
For fair admission.
Yes, Students for Fair Admission. Yes. So that organization is what's pushing this legislation. They started with a case from Houston, with Fisher versus the University of Houston. And they thought that they would be able to get that plaintiff, Ms. Fisher, into the University of Houston by saying that University of Houston discriminated against her by not admitting her. And they lost. And so, and the court there, as the court has said in the past, in the Bakke case and in the Grutter case, from 1978 on forward, courts have been very clear that having a diverse student body is a compelling state interest. And it's important to higher education bodies to have that. Sorry about those noises coming from my computer. So it's important for colleges to have that. And for those reasons, they could use race as a small factor, not a huge factor, but a small factor. And so this SFFA, they thought, well, we could win in the Fisher case, and they could not. So they brought it again in the Harvard case, and that's when they used the strategy of saying, but wait, if we say that using race discriminates against another minority group, it might get traction. And unfortunately, it did. So
is it, I'm sorry to cut you off, Professor, but isn't it? It seems to me, as I'm reading these opinions and going through some of the comments that the justices have made on prior discrimination cases in our country, but to me it seems as though they're claiming that Americans are now on a level playing field, and that is just not the case. So as you're making these decisions, I find it hard to believe that equity cannot be a part of this discussion.
Oh, equity is a key part of the discussion. And so you're absolutely right. What I predict is going to happen in 2023 when this case is decided, the justices are going to say the reason why we had affirmative action starting in the 1970s is because there wasn't a level playing field. But here we are, 30 years later, if my math is right. Man, I think
40,
my math is
yeah,
many
years.
years later, decades later, and after an African American president, and now hopefully, by the time this is decided, an African American female Supreme Court justice, we're on an even playing field. That's what the Supreme Court justices are going to say, and actually, that's kind of what they alluded to when they decided the Grutter case or Gratz case in 2004. But we know we're not on a level playing field.
By no means.
By no means are we on a level playing field, and we know that. And the moment that affirmative action door is closed, minority students will suffer. In 1996, California said, we're not going to allow affirmative action in any of we're not going to allow race-based decisions in any of our state colleges.
And how has that affected, how has that affected enrollment since then? So, California spearheaded this new initiative. They're moving forward. I don't know if you have the numbers, but has that affected enrollment for minorities in that state?
Since that time, the top two schools have lost 40% of the African American and Latino enrollment. So 40%, those colleges which used to have a high enrollment of, a higher enrollment of African Americans and Latinos, there are 40% fewer that are enrolling in those schools. So African Americans and Latinos in California are not getting into their top tier schools. They are getting into the community college and what quote unquote, lower level schools, but they're not getting the opportunities of the USCs and the UCLAs. And, and that's in California. So we can predict, we already know if affirmative action is lost in the United States as a whole, we can certainly expect a reduction of enrollment of African American, Latino, and disadvantaged minorities in our colleges.
And the other part about that, when we're talking about a level playing field, and I want to make it very clear, and I am ashamed to say it, but I have no problem saying it on the air, is that our educational system throughout this United States of ours is not equal. State by state, different educations, different school systems, different state levels of education are affected, right? So people in Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, their reading levels for high school students are not the same as the reading levels, say, in Delaware and Pennsylvania and New Jersey. We are not at an even playing field. Now, I believe if you were to take a look at so many of those cases and put a socioeconomic standard alongside of that and decide whether or not, well, those areas in which reading levels are low and math scores are lower, is there a socioeconomic correlation with that? And I believe that there is, absolutely. So if we're going to take that way of thinking, to me, it just strengthens the case for affirmative action in this country.
Oh, absolutely. And I think conservatives forget the idea that, first of all, when we are talking about race-based classifications, race cannot be in any scheme the only category that you look at for a student. So what we learned in the Gratz case, the University of Michigan cases from 2004, the court said, listen, you can look at race, but it can only be a part of it. So to your point, we can look at race as an area. We can look at socioeconomic means as an area. And guess what? There are more poor non-African Americans. Let me just say they're not African Americans, Latinos are not necessarily the poorest people in this country. By percentage, we are not.
We're only 13% of the population.
Right.
As African Americans, we're only 13% of the population. There are several other groups out there that are growing, but we've seemed to be kind of stable at this point and not making major shifts in regards to the population. So there is no way that we can be all of anything except possible prisoners, which we are leading the pack in this country.
Unfortunately. So when a school says, to your point, when a school says, we're going to we may look at the socioeconomic status of students, and the conservatives like, we don't want to look at that. We only want to look at SAT scores and GPAs. Well, you're cutting out a lot of people that look just like conservatives to not go to these colleges. So it becomes a kind of a cut your nose off to spite your face type of situation if you decide to not look at the holistic view of a student. And that's the basis of affirmative action. We're not going to look just at test scores. We're not just going to look at reading scores. We're not just going to look at GPAs. We're going to look at the whole student. What is the student bringing to this college? What diversity is the student bringing? And not necessarily the skin color. Is someone a violinist? Is someone an athlete? Does someone come from a state like Delaware where there's a small population? What can we do to make this college as diverse as possible? You don't want a college unless your college is specifically all men or specifically all women. You want a college that's 50% women, 50% men.
Let's look at this. Is this going to become a state issue? Can the state step in and say, you know what? Well, we can't do it federal, but if you're going to be a state school, you have to align yourself with certain criteria of admission. Would that be a possibility? Just playing devil's advocate. Would that be a safeguard?
Yes. Well, I think, when Bakke came out, higher ed, before the Bakke case, what the University of California was trying to do with Bakke was saying, hey, we've got 100 seats available for medical school students, and we're going to reserve 16 for underrepresented minorities and economically disadvantaged folks. Mr. Bakke, a white male, did not get he was not admitted in the 84 seats that were reserved for general admission. He tried to get into those 16 seats that were reserved for special circumstances, but he couldn't meet the criteria there either. So he sued. And that's when the court said, okay, we don't agree with quotas. We don't think that you should set aside a certain amount of seats for minorities, but we understand it's important to have minorities. And so that's where higher ed started getting really crafty. Like, okay, well, how do we do this? How do we make sure that we have minorities on our campus, but we can't have a quota? So that's when schools started looking at what we call now the holistic approach. We look at the whole student, right? And you get points for certain things. Are you an athlete? Were you in clubs? If you're an undergraduate student, like your students, were you in clubs? Are you a dancer? All these different things may give you additional points on top of your test scores and your GPA because we want diversity. With that said, if affirmative action is taken away from us, I do believe that higher ed is going to be able to pivot and come up with other criteria to make sure that their schools are diverse. The last thing any higher education institution wants is to be monolithic. I couldn't say that very well. That's what they want. You're going to want students from all across the country. You're going to want students of different genders. You're going to want students from that are African American, white, Latino, what have you. I think higher ed will pivot and will come up with different criteria so that there are diverse student populations.
Well, let's put a pin in it right there and take a quick break. I'm here with Dr. Charlisa Edelin. Sorry about that, from Delaware State University. And we are having a conversation about affirmative action, along with the upcoming case that will be coming to the Supreme Court here in our great United States on whether or not to basically end affirmative action in this country. We'll be right back on the agenda.
Auto accident, medical negligence, work injury. Contact Team Tice, your Delaware personal injury lawyers. Leroy Tice in Wilmington, Delaware, serving and supporting the people of Delaware. Call 302-489-2400. That's 302-489-2400. Online at teamtice.com.
Let DART do the driving. DART First State provides transportation that is clean, safe, reliable, and affordable. Plan your trip and get real-time bus information with the free DART Transit app. Scan your phone to pay your fare with the free DART Pass app. So what are you waiting for? Try transit today. Visit dartfirststate.com or call 1-800-652-DART.
Welcome back to the agenda. I'm your host, Kerwin Gaines, and we are this week talking about affirmative action. The Supreme Court of the United States will be hearing a case in regards to affirmative action that was brought to them by a conservative group on behalf of students attending the University of North Carolina and Harvard University. These are Asian students that feel as though they were overlooked because their grades were too high, that they were not able to execute any affirmative action status, which hindered them from entry into these universities. And this week, we are grateful to have Dr. Charlisa Edelin here on the agenda. And I'm laughing because I've jumbled her name a few times. So welcome, Dr. Edelin, here to the show. And we have had a great dialogue thus far in regards to affirmative action and what it means to not only you, but and what it means to people here in the state, how we've gotten here, right? Why we feel it is necessary, but more than ever, letting people know that in just our opinion, that by no means is America a level playing field. And I think over everything from 2020 to 2021 and in some of the racial injustices that have been shown on our regular everyday TVs to people being more aware of equity in workplaces and environments and just being more aware as a country. Some people call it being woke, but so many people here in the country are now aware of these things that it's hard to say that they're not here. So if they are here, and to the point where it's changed the culture of our country in a matter of 24 months, how are you going to take away an instrument such as affirmative action, which was an equity tool, one of the baseline equity tools that have been part of this country for over 50 years now? And so many people, great crusaders from Martin Luther King to Mr. Lewis to people right here in the in the state of Delaware that have tried to make this possible. So to your point, it is absolutely still necessary. But Del State, you made it very clear that they do not use race as a factor. So I find that awesome. I'm very curious to know what the University of Delaware uses as a factor, is affirmative action factor in regards to their decision making in regards to enrollment.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but I will say this, and this is true for every college and ours as well. Every college admits students that may not necessarily be ready. Because as we talked about earlier, there are different standards in Georgia and Alabama than New York and Maine and Delaware. But every higher education institution, when you admit a student, you are obligated then to give the student the tools that he or she needs to be successful. I was reading a conservative columnist today from the Wall Street Journal, and he was making the argument that affirmative action is not helpful to African Americans. And he quoted, and I don't know that these numbers are correct, but he said essentially 75% of all African American males that are admitted into UNC, one of the colleges that is part of this current lawsuit, actually only 30% of them actually graduate. And he was making the point that because of affirmative action, African American students are being admitted into schools that they won't be successful in, and
they're ill prepared,
and they're set up for failure. When I hear that argument, I say it's not that they're set up for failure; it's that the college is not taking on its obligation to assist them.
Right.
And that
again, thinking that everything is standard, right? So we have to treat that student the same way that I treat a student that has gone through 12 years of private school, that has had all the advantages known, private tutoring and college educated parents, and which there's nothing wrong with it, right? There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And it's the model that everybody wants to use in regards to rearing their children and preparing them for higher education. But the truth of the matter is that isn't the case for a great deal of the people here in this country. And on top of that, if they're relying on educational sources that are below standard and depending upon their community, I find it res- a responsibility of these higher education sources, such as you do, to ensure that we're bringing those students back up and then allowing them to not allowing them to move forward, but giving them an opportunity to do the very best that they can.
Absolutely. And that is, you and I have talked before about Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court justice, who says that he doesn't believe in affirmative action. And I read a little bit about his background, and he would have a different, I think, opinion if Yale had been helpful to him, had given him the tools he needed to succeed. And he talks about being one of the few African Americans on Yale's campus, that he was treated poorly. And, and I've had that experience of being the only African American in the class. And then, of course, the teacher's looking at you to explain the whole Black experience. And so I imagine that was his experience, plus just racism running rampant in Yale in the 1970s. So when a school accepts a student, they have to give them support. That didn't happen for Clarence Thomas. And I think that he has carried that bitterness with him to this day. And for
Right.
him, because when this decision comes down, I would bet $100 I don't have that he's going to agree that affirmative action should be dismantled, because for him, it ended up being a noose around his neck. It ended up being
Right.
the scarlet letter. It ended up being something where people said, you only got into Yale because you were Black. You didn't get into Yale because you were smart enough. The irony is that he was clearly smart enough. He became one of the best lawyers Yale has ever produced. I think Yale has only had 2 or 3 Supreme Court justices ever in the history of the country. And he's about to be the longest serving Supreme Court justice ever in the history of the country. So one would say he is the #1 graduate of Yale University, despite them not helping him and despite the racism that he endured. And so if I had the opportunity, I would say, Your Honor, Supreme Court Justice Thomas, don't shut the door on other young African-American or Latino folks who want to go to college and be successful in spite of what the college does or doesn't do. So that is something that, I really would, if I had him as an audience, I would talk to him about that. I don't want him to shut the door. I know he feels like the door was open for him and it didn't work out, but I would argue otherwise.
And not only that, I don't want to be trapped in nomenclature on this. Is it affirmative action or is it affirmative opportunity? Because affirmative action provides such a great opportunity for so many people, and allowed for Justice Thomas to be able to just enter Yale. They to my knowledge, and especially in the 60s, unless there were those obligations necessary, such as affirmative action, I'm pretty sure that regardless of all of his accolades, especially coming from a small university, Justice Thomas' application probably would have been passed over, right? But it was that opportunity, and just being in the environment and allowing himself to adapt to that environment and understanding the new bar that he had to get to in order to be successful. Now, that being said, was his aptitude extremely high? Absolutely. That being said, did he come from a poor background? Did he come from an environment where he was able to achieve? Well, it was hard. It was very hard for him, but he didn't always grow up going through the South Carolina school system. I mean, he went through a boarding school. He went through a small college in Massachusetts that allowed him and gave him that time to prepare his mind and prepare him for Yale Law School, and awarded him an opportunity to do that on so many levels. So, Justice Thomas brings up some very good points about, well, if that's the case, then we need to not only eliminate affirmative action, but we need to eliminate some of the testing criteria that is out there for students, because they are, in fact, racially biased themselves. And he makes that very clear that, everything down from the LSATs to the SATs themselves are culturally biased, and using those as a determining factor of the decision of whether or not a student is to matriculate onto college is, in fact, a racist ideal. So I agree with him to some extent to that. But I don't want to. I've made it clear on the show before that consequence and criteria are things that I kind of live by. So I think it is important that we still maintain some type of standard in order to do, because if we don't, then we don't have any gauge of our success, right? We don't have any gauge of how well we're doing or how bad that we're doing. But Clarence Thomas sits on the Supreme Court currently, and let's face it, he is a conservative, and he votes that way, right? And his decisions are that way. There is a lot of, and you and I have spoken off air about this a great deal. There are a lot of contradictions in regards to some of his dissents that he has made from ideas that he's had earlier in his life. Now, that being said, we all kind of change our minds as we get older and we have more experiences, but these are some very vast contradictions that he has made that really make you scratch your head and say, Justice Thomas, which side of the fence are you on? But we are at a very interesting juncture right now in our country in regards to the Supreme Court and nominating a Supreme Court. Justice Breyer is retiring, and he has been a very liberal justice on this court, on our current Supreme Court standings right now. But to that point, he is stepping down, and President Biden has made it very clear that he would like to see the first African-American female justice appointed to the Supreme Court. So being a lot, see that, what does that mean for you, Dr. Edelin?
Well, I'll be honest, when I'd forgotten that he had said that on the campaign trail. So when I was listening to the news yesterday, I stopped, and I actually had tears in my eyes because I graduated from law school in 1996. I've practiced law. I've been a lawyer a long time. It never occurred to me that someone that looks like me would sit on the bench and could sit on the bench. And I had to stop and take that in first and say, wow, you never even thought about that. And secondly, the thought that so many decisions, particularly decisions that are going to be made in this 2022 session and probably in the 2023 session, directly affect African-American women. If you take away the right to abortion, the people that are going to be adversely affected are women of color and women of minimal means. That means women that look like me will not have the rights to their own bodies. When we look at measures that looking at mask mandates, healthcare, African-American women of color are greatly affected by those things. So to have someone who looks like me that may, if she hasn't had those experiences, I know she knows someone that has had those experiences, and to have her voice. All we've ever wanted was a seat at the table. That's all we've ever wanted. And, again, I would say to Justice Thomas, you had a seat at the table. When you were there, you may not have liked the meal that they were serving, but you were there at the table. The fact that we're going to have an African-American woman at the seat at the table is, it's amazing. I was telling someone, I remember how I felt when President Barack Obama was elected. I'm having those same feelings right now about an African-American female justice.
Well, I'm excited. I think the country, especially the female population of this country, is excited because let's just take race out of it. It's another female justice being appointed to the Supreme Court, and it is the first African, hopefully and prayerfully, will be the first African-American Supreme Court justice appointed. And we're all just excited, fingers crossed, but we also know this is a political show, and we also are aware of everything political and that shenanigans are abound, right? So we know that it won't be easy. We know that some may disagree and present obstacles. So we're looking forward that we can continue to move forward and succumb these obstacles and make history. You're
absolutely right. Yeah. There will be I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
Yes, there will be obstacles. There will be a fight. Believe me, she won't get in the 30 days like Coney Barrett did. You know that Justice Barrett got in 30 days. That's not going to happen. We understand that. But we do hope that whoever she is, will get sworn in, shortly. With I'm thinking 180 days, 6 months, because Breyer said he's going to finish the term. But what a just the vision of that. I teach a course called the Supreme Court at Delaware State University, and I've been sending the students messages all day, like, what a time to be taking this class. What, we are watching history fold in front of us, which probably happens, every couple of semesters, but this semester is particularly special, particularly for the women in the course. So there will be shenanigans, but I think we're going to be successful.
Well, I hope we are. And Dr. Edelin, thank you very much for joining us this week on the agenda. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you for having me.
So there we have it, folks. Another week of the agenda in the books, but it is important that we are not forgetting about the importance of diversity in our country. Affirmative action or no affirmative action, it is just not a black and white issue. It deals with gender, race, color, creed, sexual orientation, and so many other factors. If anything, 2020 has taught us that America is not an equal place, right? There are layers and obstacles of issues that are out there that need to be addressed still for the same things that people have been fighting for the past 50, 60 years in regards to civil rights. These problems are still here. So let's do everything we can to succumb those obstacles. I look forward to seeing you next week right here on the agenda.